When they called me too conservative, I smiled and stepped aside. Little did they know, I was about to give them the most expensive lesson in risk management they'd ever receive. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I watched a multi-million-dollar company crumble because they thought my caution was weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Peterson Financial's executive conference room, casting long shadows across the mahogany table, where 12 of the company's most senior leaders sat in leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. I stood at the head of the table, my presentation remote steady in my hand, wearing the navy blazer that had become my armor in these monthly strategy meetings. For 8 years, I'd been Peterson Financial's chief risk officer, the woman who said no when everyone else wanted to say yes. Our current investment approach, I began, clicking to my first slide, has maintained steady growth of 12% annually while keeping our risk exposure at industry-low levels. The numbers glowed on the screen behind me. Clean, conservative, profitable. I recommend we continue this trajectory, perhaps exploring municipal bonds and blue-chip dividend stocks to further stabilize our portfolio. That's when Marcus Chen, our newly appointed Chief Investment Officer, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that I'd grown to recognize over the past 6 months. Marcus was 34, Harvard MBA, and absolutely convinced that he was the next Warren Buffett. He'd been hired by our CEO, David Hartwell, specifically to modernize our investment strategies, which apparently meant throwing caution to the wind. "Sarah," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying that condescending tone he reserved for what he considered outdated thinking. "With all due respect, 12% growth is hardly impressive in today's market. While you've been playing it safe with your grandmother's investment strategies, companies like Goldman and Morgan Stanley are seeing returns of 30, even 40% on their alternative investments." A murmur rippled through the room. I could see the board members exchanging glances, some nodding along with Marcus, others looking uncomfortable with his dismissive tone. David Hartwell sat at the far end of the table, his fingers steepled, watching this exchange like it was a tennis match he was betting on. "Those higher returns come with exponentially higher risks," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Alternative investments, cryptocurrency ventures, and high-leverage trading strategies might produce impressive short-term gains, but they can also wipe out decades of careful growth in a matter of weeks." Marcus laughed, actually laughed, and turned to address the room rather than me. This is exactly the kind of conservative thinking that's been holding Peterson Financial back. We're not some small-town credit union, people. We manage over $8 billion in assets. Our clients expect innovation, not fear-based decision-making. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I'd learned long ago that showing emotion in a room full of sharks was like bleeding in the ocean. "I prefer to call it prudent risk management," I said calmly. "The strategies I've implemented have protected our clients through 3 major market downturns, including the 2008 crisis and the pandemic volatility. 0 client losses, consistent growth. 0 excitement, 0 competitive edge." Marcus cut me off again. This time, several board members chuckled. "Sarah, I appreciate your cautious approach, but frankly, it's becoming a liability. Our competitors are eating our lunch while we're still counting pennies." David finally spoke up, his gravelly voice commanding immediate attention. "Marcus has presented some compelling opportunities," he said, not looking directly at me. "The blockchain investment fund, the emerging markets portfolio, the algorithmic trading program. These could potentially double our annual returns." I clicked to my next slide, showing detailed risk assessments I'd prepared for each of Marcus's opportunities. "David, these investments would expose us to regulatory risks we can't control, market volatility that could swing 40% in either direction, and technological vulnerabilities that we can manage." Marcus interrupted for the 3rd time. "Sarah, I understand that change is scary, but this company needs leaders who can adapt, not anchors who drag us down." The room fell silent. The word anchor hung in the air like smoke from a gun. I looked around the table at faces I'd worked alongside for nearly a decade. People whose financial security I'd protected, whose trust I'd earned through consistent, careful stewardship of their investments and those of our clients. "My risk assessments," I began, but David raised his hand. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah, we appreciate your dedication, but the board has been discussing this for several weeks. We've decided to move forward with a more aggressive investment strategy. Marcus will be taking point on our new portfolio direction, and we'd like you to support his vision. Support his vision. The corporate euphemism for shut up and fall in line. I looked at Marcus, who was trying to hide his triumphant smile behind a coffee cup. Then I looked at David, whose eyes had already moved to his phone screen. I see, I said quietly. And if I have concerns about specific investments? Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. Sarah, I think what David is trying to say is that your input will be valuable, but the final decisions will rest with someone who has a more progressive understanding of modern finance. Progressive. As if recklessness was innovation. As if gambling with other people's life savings was somehow forward-thinking. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, a 73-year-old widow who'd entrusted us with her husband's life insurance money. I thought about the Johnson family, who'd saved for 15 years to send their daughter to college. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet to me. They were real people with real dreams. I understand, I said, closing my laptop with a soft click. In that case, I think it's best if I step aside and let Marcus implement his vision without any interference from someone as conservative as myself. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Heavier. David looked up from his phone with a slight frown. Sarah, there's no need for dramatics. We're simply adjusting our strategy. I'm not being dramatic, I replied, gathering my materials into my briefcase. I'm being practical. Marcus is right. I am conservative. I believe in protecting our clients, assets, in sustainable growth, in sleeping well at night knowing that we haven't risked people's retirements on speculative investments. Since that philosophy is apparently incompatible with the company's new direction, I'll be submitting my resignation this afternoon. Marcus's smug expression faltered. Sarah, wait. But I was already walking toward the door. I'll have my final risk assessments on your desk by 5 o'clock, I said without turning around. After that, the company's financial future will be entirely in your capable hands. I walked out of that conference room with my head held high, but inside my heart was pounding. 8 years of my life, 8 years of building systems and safeguards and relationships, all of it dismissed because I refused to gamble with other people's money. As I made my way back to my office, I could hear the buzz of conversation resuming behind me, probably Marcus explaining why my departure was actually a blessing in disguise. My office overlooked the city's financial district, a view I'd earned through years of proving myself in a male-dominated industry. The walls were lined with certifications, awards, and photos from client appreciation events, testimonials to a career built on trust and competence rather than flash and promises. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop one last time as Peterson Financial's chief risk officer. The resignation letter practically wrote itself. Professional, concise, with no hint of the frustration that had been building for months as I watched Marcus chip away at everything I'd built. I kept it simple. Due to philosophical differences regarding risk management strategies, I would be resigning my position effective in 2 weeks, pending the completion of ongoing projects and the transition of my responsibilities. As I typed, I couldn't help but think about the presentation I'd been preparing for next month's board meeting. I'd been tracking some concerning trends in the markets, indicators that suggested we might be heading for another period of volatility. Interest rates were climbing, inflation was putting pressure on consumer spending, and several of the sectors Marcus wanted to invest heavily in were showing signs of being overvalued. But that wasn't my problem anymore. In 2 weeks, Marcus would have complete control over Peterson Financial's investment strategy, and the consequences of his decisions would be his to own. I printed out my resignation letter, signed it with the same Mont Blanc pen I'd used to sign my employment contract 8 years ago, and placed it in an envelope addressed to David Hartwell. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of awkward conversations and whispered speculation. News of my resignation spread through the office faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Some colleagues stopped by to express their shock and disappointment. Others seemed relieved, Perhaps they'd grown tired of my cautious approach too. Or maybe they were just eager to see what Marcus's bold new strategies would bring. Jennifer Walsh, my deputy and the person most likely to understand the real implications of what was happening, appeared in my doorway around 4 o'clock. She was 36, brilliant with numbers, and had been my right hand for the past 3 years. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern. "Is it true?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "Are you really leaving?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "It's true. The company wants to move in a different direction, and that direction doesn't include my approach to risk management." Jennifer sat down heavily. "Sarah, the models you've built, the safeguards you've put in place, they've saved this company millions of dollars over the years. The board has to know that. The board wants growth, Jennifer. Impressive quarterly numbers they can brag about to shareholders. My 12% annual returns aren't sexy enough anymore." I pulled out a thick folder and slid it across the desk to her. "These are all my current risk assessments, including some preliminary analysis of the market's trends I've been monitoring. I'm not supposed to interfere with Marcus's vision, but I want you to have this information." She flipped through the pages, her expression growing more serious with each chart and projection. "Sarah, some of these indicators, if you're right about this market instability, if I'm right, then Marcus's aggressive investments could put the company in serious jeopardy." I finished. "But I'm just a conservative old anchor, remember? What do I know about modern finance?" Jennifer looked up from the folder, her eyes reflecting the same concern I'd been carrying for months. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "Whatever you think is right," I said. "But Jennifer, if things start going sideways, and I mean really sideways, you need to protect yourself. Update your resume, maintain your professional networks, and don't go down with the ship out of misplaced loyalty." We sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the weight of what wasn't being said. I was leaving behind more than just a job. I was abandoning a company I'd helped build, colleagues I cared about, and clients whose financial futures I'd been protecting. But I couldn't compromise my principles, couldn't put my name on strategies I knew were dangerous. At exactly 5 o'clock, I walked into David's office and placed my resignation letter on his desk. He looked up from his computer with surprise, as if he'd forgotten about our morning confrontation. "Sarah, I hope you'll reconsider." "I won't," I said simply. "But I do hope you'll reconsider the path you're taking. The risks Marcus is proposing aren't theoretical. They're real, and they could destroy everything we've built here." David's expression hardened. "Sarah, I respect your expertise, but Marcus has shown us projections that could triple our returns within 2 years. That's the kind of growth our shareholders expect." "And what happens if those projections are wrong?" I asked. "What happens to Mrs. Rodriguez's retirement fund? What happens to the Johnson family's college savings? What happens to the $8 billion in assets that real people have trusted us to protect?" "That's exactly the kind of fear-based thinking that's been holding us back," David replied, echoing Marcus's words from the morning meeting. "Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve extraordinary results." I almost laughed at the irony. "David, I've spent my entire career taking calculated risks. The difference is that I actually calculate them." I turned toward the door, then paused. "I'll spend the next 2 weeks documenting all my current projects and risk models. After that, the company's financial future will be entirely in Marcus's hands. I just hope, for everyone's sake, that his confidence is justified." Walking out of Peterson Financial that evening, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because I no longer had to bite my tongue while watching potentially catastrophic decisions being made. Anxiety because I knew what was coming. I'd seen the warning signs, done the analysis, run the models. Marcus's bold strategy was going to fail, and when it did, it wouldn't just hurt the company's profits. It would devastate real people's lives. But for the first time in months, I wasn't the one responsible for preventing that disaster. I'd tried to warn them, tried to protect them, tried to be the voice of reason in a room full of people drunk on the promise of easy money. They'd chosen to ignore that voice, to dismiss it as outdated thinking from someone too conservative to understand modern finance. Soon enough, they'd learn the true cost of that decision. And when they did, I'd be watching from the sidelines, no longer the anchor holding them back, but the lighthouse they should have followed to avoid the rocks ahead. 2 weeks later, I walked out of Peterson Financial for the last time, carrying a small box containing the few personal items I'd accumulated over 8 years. The security guard, Michael, who'd always greeted me with a warm smile every morning, looked genuinely sad as he processed my exit paperwork. "Going to miss seeing you around here, Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly. "This place won't be the same without you." I thanked him and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, feeling lighter than I had in months. My phone had been buzzing all morning with messages from former colleagues, industry contacts, and even a few competitors who'd somehow heard about my departure. The financial world was smaller than most people realized, and news traveled fast when someone with my reputation made a move. Within a week of my departure becoming public, I received 3 job offers from competing firms. Each one came with a significant salary increase and promises of autonomy that Peterson Financial had never offered. But something inside me hesitated. After 8 years of building systems and safeguards for someone else's company, the idea of starting fresh somewhere new felt both exciting and daunting. Instead of jumping into another corporate role, I decided to take some time to think. I used my savings to rent a small office space downtown and officially launched Mitchell Risk Consulting. If companies wanted my expertise, they could hire me on my terms, for projects I believed in, using strategies I could stand behind. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. My first client was Sandra Chen, a brilliant entrepreneur who'd built a successful tech startup and was looking to diversify her investments. She'd heard about my departure from Peterson Financial through mutual connections and wanted someone who wouldn't just tell her what she wanted to hear. "I don't need a yes person," she told me during our first meeting. "I need someone who'll protect me from my own optimism." Working with Sandra reminded me why I'd fallen in love with finance in the first place. It wasn't about impressive quarterly numbers or beating the competition. It was about helping real people make smart decisions with their money. We developed a conservative but effective investment strategy that balanced growth potential with security, and within 6 months, her portfolio was outperforming the market average while maintaining low-risk exposure. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on what was happening at my former company through Jennifer, who sent me occasional updates via encrypted messages. Marcus had wasted no time implementing his bold new strategies. He'd moved 60% of the company's assets into high-risk investments: cryptocurrency funds, emerging market speculation, and complex derivative instruments that even seasoned traders approached with caution. "The quarterly numbers look amazing," Jennifer texted me in December. "Marcus is being hailed as a genius. David's already talking about promoting him to senior vice president." I wasn't surprised. High-risk investments often produced impressive short-term gains. That's what made them so seductive. It was the long-term consequences that people like Marcus preferred not to think about. I'd seen this pattern before. Dramatic early success followed by equally dramatic failures when market conditions inevitably shifted. The shift began in February. It started small, just a few concerning indicators that most people dismissed as normal market fluctuations. Interest rates climbed faster than expected. Consumer confidence began to waver. Several tech companies reported disappointing earnings, sending ripples through the sectors Marcus had heavily invested in. I was reviewing client portfolios in my office when Jennifer called, her voice tight with stress. "Sarah, we need to talk. Can you meet me for coffee?" An hour later, we sat in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe, Jennifer clutching her coffee cup like it was a lifeline. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. "It's starting to fall apart," she said without preamble. "The cryptocurrency fund Marcus invested in dropped 30% last week. The emerging markets portfolio is hemorrhaging money. And the algorithmic trading system, God, Sarah, it's making decisions so fast that no one can keep up with the losses. I felt no satisfaction in being right. These weren't just numbers on a screen. They represented real people's retirement savings, college funds, and dreams for the future." "How bad is it?" I asked. "Bad. Marcus keeps insisting it's temporary, that the markets will bounce back, but the losses are accelerating. We've lost over $400 million in the past month alone." Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. "And David is starting to panic. He's been calling emergency board meetings, demanding explanations that Marcus can't provide." Over the following weeks, I watched from the outside as Peterson Financial's situation deteriorated. The financial press, which had initially praised Marcus's innovative approach, began asking harder questions. Industry analysts who'd celebrated the company's impressive quarterly gains were now warning about unsustainable risk exposure. My phone started ringing. First, it was other companies in the industry wanting to know if I was available for consulting work. Apparently, my reputation for conservative risk management was suddenly very appealing again. Then it was reporters, seeking my perspective on what was happening at Peterson Financial. I declined all interview requests, maintaining professional discretion despite my personal feelings. But the call I'd been expecting finally came on a gray Thursday morning in March. David Hartwell's name appeared on my caller ID, and I let it ring twice before answering. Sarah. His voice was strained, lacking the confidence I remembered from our last conversation. I hope you're doing well. I was wondering if we could meet. There are some developments at the company that I'd like to discuss with you. I'm quite busy with my consulting practice, I replied calmly. But I suppose I could spare an hour next week if it's important. It's important, he said quickly. Very important. Could we meet sooner? Perhaps tomorrow? I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice, but I maintained my professional composure. I'll check my schedule and get back to you. The next afternoon, I walked into the same conference room where Marcus had dismissed my conservative approach as outdated thinking. The atmosphere was dramatically different now. Gone was the confident energy and optimistic chatter. In its place was a palpable tension that seemed to press against the windows like storm clouds. David sat at the head of the table, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the 4 months since I'd left. Marcus was there too, but he'd lost his swagger. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat in his posture or the fear in his eyes. Sarah, David began, thank you for coming. I'll get straight to the point. We're in trouble, serious trouble. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for him to continue. The aggressive investment strategy we implemented has resulted in significant losses, $700 million and counting. Our clients are demanding answers, some are threatening to pull their assets, and the board is, well, they're not happy. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice lacking its former arrogance. Sarah, I know we had our differences, but the situation has become quite challenging. The market conditions weren't what we anticipated, and some of our projections were perhaps overly optimistic. Perhaps overly optimistic. It took all my self-control not to laugh at the understatement. I see, I said simply. And how can I help you? David leaned forward, desperation evident in his expression. We want you to come back. As Chief Risk Officer, with full authority over investment strategy, we'll give you whatever you need. Budget, staff, complete autonomy. Just help us fix this. I let the silence stretch out, studying both men carefully. Finally, I spoke. When you asked me to support Marcus's vision, you made it clear that my conservative approach was holding the company back. You called me an anchor. You dismissed 8 years of successful risk management as fear-based thinking. Why should I believe things would be different now? Because we were wrong, David said, the admission clearly painful. Marcus's approach produced impressive short-term gains, but we didn't fully understand the long-term risks. We should have listened to your concerns. Marcus nodded vigorously. Sarah, your risk assessments were spot on. If we'd followed your recommendations, we wouldn't be in this situation. I was arrogant, and I'm sorry. I appreciated the apology, but apologies wouldn't restore the hundreds of millions of dollars that had been lost or rebuild the trust that had been shattered. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Complete control over investment strategy, David replied. A 50% salary increase, equity participation, and a seat on the board of directors. Plus a significant bonus if you can stabilize our position and restore client confidence. It was a generous offer, more than generous. It was also an admission of just how desperate they'd become. I'll need to think about it, I said, standing up. I'll give you my answer by Monday. Over the weekend, I weighed my options carefully. Returning to Peterson Financial would mean inheriting a disaster that would take years to fully resolve. It would mean rebuilding trust with clients who'd lost faith in the company's judgment. It would mean working alongside people who'd dismissed my expertise until crisis, forced them to acknowledge its value. But it would also mean having the opportunity to implement the kind of comprehensive risk management system I'd always envisioned. It would mean protecting the remaining client assets from further losses. And yes, it would mean proving that conservative, thoughtful investment strategies weren't just defensive measures. They were the foundation of sustainable success. On Monday morning, I called David with my answer. I'll return, but with conditions. Complete authority over all investment decisions, immediate implementation of my risk management protocols, and Marcus's resignation from his current position. If he wants to remain with the company, he can work under my supervision as a junior analyst until he learns the value of prudent risk assessment. There was a long pause before David responded. Done. When can you start? I never stopped working, I replied. I'll be in this afternoon to begin damage control. Walking back into Peterson Financial felt surreal. The same building, the same elevator, the same view from the windows, but everything had changed. The confident energy that had once filled the halls had been replaced by nervous tension. Employees spoke in hushed tones, and I caught more than a few relieved glances as word spread about my return. Jennifer met me at the elevator, her face showing the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. "Welcome back, Chief," she said, using the title that felt both familiar and strange after my months away. The first weeks were brutal. I worked 18-hour days, systematically reviewing every investment Marcus had made, calculating losses, assessing remaining risks, and developing strategies to minimize further damage. Slowly, methodically, I began the process of unwinding the most dangerous positions and shifting assets back towards stable, growth-oriented investments. The financial press covered my return extensively, with headlines like, "Conservative Captain Returns to Steady the Ship," and "Risk Management Expert Takes Helm of Troubled Firm." But I didn't care about the headlines. I cared about the phone call I received from Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly widow whose retirement account had lost 30% of its value. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, her voice shaky but hopeful. "I heard you came back. Does this mean my money is safe now?" "Mrs. Rodriguez," I replied, "I can't promise to recover everything that was lost, but I can promise that we'll protect what remains and work to rebuild your savings responsibly. You have my word." It took 18 months to fully stabilize Peterson Financial's position. 18 months of careful portfolio restructuring, client relationship rebuilding, and systematic risk reduction. The process wasn't glamorous. There were no impressive quarterly spikes or media celebrations, just steady, sustainable progress toward financial health. But the results spoke for themselves. Client withdrawals stopped and eventually reversed as confidence returned. The company's risk exposure dropped to industry low levels while maintaining consistent, if modest, growth. Most importantly, we never again lost sight of the fact that behind every investment decision were real people with real dreams that deserved protection. Marcus did stay with the company, working as a junior analyst under my supervision. To his credit, he approached the role with humility and genuine desire to learn. Over time, he became one of my most effective team members, someone who understood both the appeal of high-risk, high-reward investments and the critical importance of managing that risk responsibly. During a team meeting 2 years after my return, Marcus presented a proposal for a moderate expansion into emerging markets, carefully researched, thoroughly analyzed, with comprehensive risk mitigation strategies. It was exactly the kind of balanced approach that Peterson Financial needed. "This is excellent work," I told him as the meeting concluded. "It shows real growth in your analytical thinking and risk assessment skills." He smiled, expression free of the arrogance that had once defined him. "I had a good teacher," he said. "Someone who showed me that being conservative isn't about avoiding opportunity, it's about pursuing opportunity intelligently." As I looked around the conference room that afternoon, seeing my team of dedicated professionals working together to build something sustainable and valuable, I realized that being called too conservative had been the best thing that ever happened to my career. It had forced me to leave a situation where my expertise wasn't valued and create one where it could truly flourish. Sometimes the greatest risk is not taking enough risk, but more often, especially in the world of finance, the greatest risk is taking too much risk. without understanding the consequences. My conservative approach hadn't held Peterson Financial back. It had been the foundation that made everything else possible. In business, as in life, the boldest move isn't always the smartest one. Sometimes wisdom lies in patience, prudence, and the courage to say no when everyone else is saying yes. They'd called me too conservative, as if caution was weakness. Instead, I'd shown them that true strength comes from protecting what matters most, even when it's not popular, even when it's not exciting, and especially when everyone else thinks you're wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.